Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to the 2020 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series, hosted by the University of Illinois Extension's Local Food Systems and Small Farm team. Once again, this is Zach Grant, Local Food Systems Small Farm Educator in Cook County, your moderator and coordinator for all your weekly dive into all things small farms. We really appreciate you joining us once again for these webinars, and we're going to do our best to begin and end with the space of the lunch hour. So please, we want you to direct your questions to the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer the questions either live or at the end of the presentation with our main presenter. This presentation is being recorded, and I will email you a link to the archive presentation as soon as possible at the end of the, towards the end of the day. There will also be a short online evaluation for this presentation included in the email, so we really much appreciate your feedback. You'll also see it on the last slide of Grant's presentation today. There will be a QR code that links directly to the survey, so you can use your smartphone camera or your QR code reader app to directly take the evaluation at the end of today's presentation. We are using Zoom's webinar platform this year, so there's a few additional features I just want to quickly point out. There is a poll at the bottom of your screen, so if you click on the poll, I see some of you have already begun filling out our voluntary demographic information. It's really useful for us to collect this information. So if you go ahead and complete that, that would be great. There's also a Q&A section and a chat box. So if you could keep the questions that you will have for Grant in the Q&A box, and we'll reserve the chat for some of your technical problems that you may be having. So this week's presentation is from Grant McCarty. Grant's my fellow local food small farm educator in Joe Davies, Stevenson, Winnebago counties in northwestern Illinois. He's originally from East Tennessee, and Grant works both with commercial and backyard growers, mainly focusing in fruit and vegetable production. He has some expertise in soil management, hops production, general organic sustainable crop production. He assists stakeholders within the local food system in helping them to expand their operation, adopt new practices, and better manage their current production. Grant's educational background started with a bachelor's in sociology from Maryville College, and then he did his graduate work in plant sciences at the University of Tennessee. Over the next 2 weeks, we're going to be taking a deep dive into topics related to soil and media management. This week, Grant is going to take us on a detailed deep dive regarding soil organic matter, and next week, I will actually be discussing saturated media extract testing as an alternate soil and media test for certain conditions. With that, I'm going to relinquish the floor to Grant. Go ahead and take it over, Grant.
All right. Well, thank you, Zach. Thank you for the introduction. Happy to be here with you all today, especially talking about a subject that's really something I really get excited about and really like to share with others. Most of my work in our extension unit and kind of in our area tends to be working a lot in soil science, and particularly in soil biology. And over the last couple of years, we're starting to see a lot of folks that are beginning to kind of wonder a bit more about the soil health, as well as the soil organic matter that they have in their growing area, and beginning to kind of also wonder a bit more about how to use organic matters effectively, what they are, and kind of what they're doing to the soil. So what I tried to really do today was to kind of zero in and hit some of these highlights when it comes to managing and using organic matters, as well as addressing what your soil organic matter is in the soil itself. So if you are familiar with some of these principles of soil biology and soil health, this might be a bit of a refresher for you today, kind of as we go along. Let's see. All right, so to get us going, just as a refresher, what is soil? What are the four components of it? This is our mineral solids, which is our sand, our silt, and the clay. So that kind of that soil texture is where the mineral solids really tend to be. We have water in the soil, the H2O solution. We also have air in the soil, allowing for good oxygen exchange. And then we have the soil organic matter. So this SOM, which you'll hear we talk about a lot kind of as we go along today. And we really are talking about the soil organic matter here. When you get a soil test done, you get this measurement back to you that lists the soil organic matter. And usually what we see on a typical soil test is that it's about 1 to 7% of your overall soil. The issue, though, is that 45% of the soil phosphorus and 95% of the soil nitrogen is actually within this percentage. And sometimes I have soil tests that come across my desk that are 2, 3%. Sometimes we see up to 5, 6%. But I think it's important to realize from a grower perspective, you play a direct role in this. And this is a positive thing. You could be adding compost, manure, growing cover crops, leaf litter, and so forth, which would be breaking down and eventually add to this percentage. Or you could be doing a lot of negative things. So it would maybe be doing a lot of heavy tilling every year, not adding any organic matter. Maybe exposing the soil to soil surface without having any kind of layer or protection. So you have a direct role here, and it's very important that you kind of recognize this, especially going forward today with it. And we'll talk more about this even more so. As you look more into soil health and maybe think about that with your soil, you will find that soil organic matter tends to be a very strong focus in soil health and the overall soil health management of your soil. A couple of additional things that soil organic matter does, and this is where you'll see SOM, so I'll use that throughout today's presentation, and I'm talking about soil organic matter. It addresses soil aeration, water infiltration, so it really helps both of those things when it comes to kind of making sure that the soil is resistant to compaction and allowing for good water and air exchange to occur. It also improves quite a bit of our water holding capacity, the ability for the soil to hold water in for our plants to utilize and pick it up. It can also help quite a bit when it comes to the ability to resist any soil pH changes that you might see. And then what we'll talk a lot about today is that this soil organic matter actually provides a lot of food for the microorganisms and the soil biological communities with it. You may also find that it will enhance pore space with it as well. So when you get a soil test and you say my soil test came back and it was a 2 to 3%, of that 2 to 3%, you may know a little bit as far as, as you kind of see in this photo here. This 2 to 3% would include a percentage of decomposing organic matter that's called the active fraction. It would also include a stabilized organic matter, which is known as humus, of that 2 to 3%. So kind of that, between 33 to 50% of that 2 to 3% is decomposing organic matter, which is called this active fraction. Talk a little bit more about that as we go along today. In most cases, the organic matter that you've added in the last 4 to 5 years, your compost, your leaf litter, your cover crops that you might be growing, it is still within this category of active fraction. So it is still decomposing organic matter. But our long-term goal is to actually get it to become this stabilized organic matter, this humus of 33 to 50%. So organic matters then are products that will add to and stabilize your soil organic matter. When I add compost to my soil, or I add leaf litter or manure, it will be decomposing, it will be breaking down, and it will eventually, we hope, get to that percentage of soil organic matter. So it's a very long game to get there, and that's what's really happening when you're adding the organic matter. It's usually entering the soil as a fresh ingredient. So even if it has been a little bit stabilized, say like a compost or an aged manure perhaps, it is still kind of what we consider a fresh ingredient at this point. It's got to be broken down and decomposed by our soil biology. It addresses soil health problems, like I've shared with you, compaction, water retention, soil structure. Typically, when we have a grower that we're working with that has one of these health problems, we kind of ask, we kind of tend to recommend an organic matter as the best recommendation for addressing this. Organic matters depend highly on soil biology, and they need to have some kind of interaction. We'll talk more about this as we go along today. This interaction really needs to occur in order for my organic matters to break down to eventually enter into that soil organic matter percentage. There's two broad categories of organic matters in this case. The added, so this is something with manure, plant residue, mulches, compost, something in which you're actually bringing and adding onto the soil surface or turning into the soil itself. And then you have your cover crops. So you're actually growing your own organic matters, both above ground and below ground in this situation. So trends in organic matters and the soil organic matter research right now. I will tell you, as someone who really is interested and very passionate about soil biology and soil organic matter, it is a great time to be observing a lot of this research. There's a lot of new information that's been coming out in the last couple of years, and we're seeing a lot of great information to kind of guide the small farmer and these growers when determining how to better address your soil health and to really address the soil organic matter. As I've looked through and kind of looked through some of my resources this last week, what we have started to see is a lot of greater focus on roots, meaning that these roots from organic matter, like a cover crop or even say from a cash crop, are already growing in the soil. And these roots are just covered in microbial communities that are getting root exudates and sugars off of these roots. And when they start to decompose, the cover crop dies, or your cash crop you're done with, the roots are already in direct contact with the soil and they're breaking down pretty well. And so that is where we're starting to maybe see more organic matter research occurring, and a greater focus will be on the root systems of these organic matters. Sorry guys, had a phone call. Stacy, I'm on a conference call. Okay, sorry, geez. They're providing diverse organic matters. They're examining responses of organic matters on the soil surface versus turned into the soil. All that being said, best practices may change, but still many questions still remain. There's a lot of things that we're still trying to find out more about when it comes to organic matters. So, is organic matter soil organic matter? Yes, kind of, sort of. It's a fresh ingredient you're adding on a yearly basis. It's eventually going to get to that soil organic matter, but know that it could take decades. It could take 3 to 5 years to just finally be breaking down and start moving to the next step, but you still could have decades for it to actually get to that end goal of soil organic matter. It's considered active organic matter. This is something that's less than 5 years that you have added to the soil. The end goal is, of course, to become a stable organic matter, which, as shared with you, can take decades. It's a very imperfect situation, though. Depending on how the organic matter is added to the soil, if it's out on the soil surface, depending on your soil texture, your soil properties, the environmental changes, environmental conditions, all of those are impacting the organic matter that you're adding on a seasonal basis, eventually getting to the soil organic matter. So there's a lot to still research and a lot to still find out. Is organic matter a fertilizer? Yes, kind of, sort of. It does have, in most cases, some NPK value, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. But what we really see is that organic matter has a very, very low NPK value at this stage. And sometimes that NPK value isn't just available yet for my plants to take up during that season, especially for an annual plant. So it will have some, but it may not be enough for you on that seasonal basis. A lot of it still depends on soil biology. It's also important to recognize that it can sometimes take years to kind of fully release all of that NPK value of that particular organic matter. Some of these can be easily released, the NPK values, pretty quickly in a season, but some of them can take quite a bit of time. So don't always consider these your annual fertilizers, but recognize that they will address sometimes nutrient issues with it. If you were to grow a cover crop that is an organic matter, in most cases, some of them will have some nitrogen, especially if it's a leguminous cover crop, and that will address sometimes your soil fertility needs in that season. Some of our cover crops will actually scavenge for nutrients further depths of the soil and bring up to the soil surface. But certainly, you have to kind of figure out which ones you're growing in that situation. If I was an organic grower or pursuing organic certification or wanting to use some of these practices, you are depending quite heavily on the organic matters to be your fertilizers and to be providing those nutrients in the seasonal basis. That's just kind of what we really see. And yet again, you're still kind of reflecting back on what your soil test is telling you. Over time, if you were continually adding organic matters, you would find that the soil test may be able to really help you to kind of ease back on some of the annual fertilizers that you may be using. I get this question quite a lot. What is the best organic matter for me? Folks will say, I've tried this one. What about this one? What about this one? What about mushroom compost versus compost made from worms? It's a great question, but I really think it has to be decided by you. I think that depending on what your situation is, sometimes the best organic matter is the one that depends on lots of things. It could be your farming plans. What are your long-term plans when it comes to growing fruits, growing vegetables, growing other crops with it? And you may find that organic matters fit in well with some of these and some of them don't. When we think about, say, some of our perennial fruits, perennial berries, for instance, an organic matter for them is going to mostly look like wood chips or wood mulches that are on the soil surface, versus maybe an annual vegetable planting where we would then see more of compost, aged manure, cover cropping systems that fit in well with it. I also encourage you to think about your access. Some years you may have access to manure that you didn't have previously. Or maybe you have a couple of growers in your area and they have all kind of come together to purchase cover crop seeds. And so now you've got access to cover crop seeds that you didn't have otherwise with it. Budgeting can also be a factor in here, thinking about what the budget on a yearly basis looks like for utilizing organic matters in that situation. Keep in mind also management and equipment, and I think this is especially important as we think about growing our own organic matters like cover crops. You may not have the right equipment and the right ability to manage these when it comes to the cover crops you're planning to grow. In addition, you might look a little bit at soil physical properties. Some of these organic matters may worsen a compaction issue that you may already have and not allow for as much good airflow and water exchange as you would like. So that could sometimes be a factor within this. What we do somewhat see is that most will have pretty similar quality, especially as we think about, a compost or a manure. If you're debating which manure to choose, you will find some fairly similarities with the quality of it. The same with your compost. Compost will look a little bit similar to it too. But I encourage folks to really think about the long game here. Really you're thinking about diverse organic matters and adding a diverse amount of organic matters throughout your farming experience. So if I was adding compost last summer in 2019, I might be looking to do a different organic matter this upcoming year, and potentially another different organic matter next year. And I would think that this is also fits in well if you think about some of your long-term crop rotations, factoring in sometimes what your organic matter rotations could look like within here too would be really great. We're not at a point just yet to be able to say that this organic matter should be followed up with this organic matter, followed up by this organic matter on a yearly basis. But I think we might be getting there at some point as we discover more and more about how the soil is responding and how our plants are responding in these biological communities. Every organic matter that you choose and you utilize in your soil will tend to have many of these ingredients, so that you'll find fresh organic residues in compost, manure, sometimes even some of our cover crops you'll see this. Sugars, starches, and proteins will also sometimes be in the organic matter that you're choosing. And then for kind of woodier plant material, we see lignins, and fats, waxes tend to be a little bit more in our manure, and some of our other organic matters too. The last category tends to be resistant to decomposition. So it's something that the microorganisms just don't tend to gravitate towards, don't tend to like too much. So it tends to go straight to the humus itself. I would encourage you to really focus on these first two categories, your fresh organic residue, as well as the sugar, starches, and proteins. And that's you're going to find with most organic matters, is that they will have these good products themselves. In thinking about the soil biology and its kind of role within the organic matter, we have to kind of step back a little bit and think a bit about ecology. In this way, as we're thinking about ecology, thinking about a forest food web or an ocean food web, really we have a soil food web. This is really what we see when we actually get samples in the soil and we actually look in the soil itself. Around the plants, we have a lot of soil biological activity. The funguses, the bacteria, they're all kind of hanging out in these root systems, and they are kind of covering these roots, and they're getting root exudates and sugars and so forth. They're not attacking the roots, but they are actually getting some kind of food from these roots. At the same time, if you add organic matter, such as compost, manure, and so forth, or any plant residues that break down, that's also acting as food for this kind of first level of nematodes, fungi, and bacteria, which are starting to eat, starting to decompose. And as their populations get bigger, as they reproduce, we then have our predators that move in, such as protozoa or nematodes or arthropods. And they will then consume and eat their prey. And it gets bigger and bigger and bigger at this point, when we have bigger predators that move into this system. So this is really what's happening, when you add an organic matter to the soil, or when you actually have plants growing in the soil, is that this is happening. The soil food web is occurring. In a perennial system where the plant roots are stable and you're not changing it, this soil food web tends to be pretty closed. We tend to maybe see some fluctuations of these microbial communities versus an annual system where we may see some fluctuations depending on the season itself. More about this then. Every organism has a role. The needs of these organisms tend to be that they need food. Okay, that's kind of expected. They need to have some kind of food source to eat. They need a conducive environment, something that allows for them to reproduce, to respire, to grow and to eat and build up their communities. And then they also need a bit of a minimal disturbance. That's really kind of what they're after here in order to kind of create and keep this soil food web and their biological needs met. To share with you what some of the main ones do, bacteria, converts energy into soil organic matter for other organisms. It assists quite a bit in nutrient cycling, sometimes with plant pathogen disease suppression in the soil. It can fix nitrogen on leguminous crops from the atmosphere. Fungus, they tend to produce hyphae that move through soil particles. That helps quite a bit when it comes to kind of making sure that we're getting good airflow and water infiltration too. They assist quite a bit with water, nutrient cycling, disease suppression. We have three groups of them: mutualistic, pathogenic, or pathogens, as well as a decomposer. Mutualistic you will sometimes see as mycorrhizal. Most root systems on the plant will have some sort of mycorrhizal development, which allows for that plant to have a greater surface area and allows for the roots to kind of go to and kind of spread out too. For nematodes, these are of course microscopic worms. They eat bacteria, fungi, protozoa, and other nematodes, so kind of acting as a predator in this situation. When a nematode eats bacteria and excretes, this excretion usually has many of the soil nutrients that my plants need. So it is kind of through that predation that we will sometimes have nitrogen and other things enter the nutrient cycle through eating of bacteria and excreting. Grazing also tends to stimulate populations, so they will tend to kind of, if there is more food for them, they will kind of graze a bit more to it, especially with soil biological communities that might build up a bit more. Our earthworms and some of our other worms tend to be a shredder, so a major decomposer of dead and decomposing organic matter. They sometimes will pull organic matter above the soil kind of surface down to lower soil depth. Think of this a bit like if you have, say, a mulch on the soil surface layer, you may find that some of the earthworms are actually sometimes pulling down some of that organic matter into the soil to help it decompose so that it can also eat too. They tend to stimulate microbial activity. They have a very positive influence on soil organic matter, and of course also help a lot with water infiltration. Another thing they do is they tend to disperse microbes around the soil. I tend to think of this that a lot of our smaller microbes like bacteria, fungi, they kind of hitchhike on the earthworms, and as the earthworms are moving through the soil, these hitchhikers are also being distributed too. So via soil biology, organic matters can decompose in a matter of weeks, months, yet they can still be decomposing for years and decades. The photo that you see here kind of shows this in some capacity, where fresh residue is breaking down after days with soil organism, biomass, and metabolism. After months and years, the same product is still breaking down, and then it could be decades before it finally enters the stable organic matter. Yet again, we are still losing some of this to the atmosphere in most cases. If it's on the soil surface or into the soil, you may find some soil biological interactions occur with some limitations. We do tend to see that direct contact into that actual 0 to 6 inches tends to be where a lot of biological activity really occurs. It allows for these organic matters to really break down. At the same time, I'd be remiss to not mention that having something on the soil surface is going to break down and decompose, but it just may not break down, and we may lose some from that atmosphere as well. You should also be combining this with crop rotation. Don't mention that enough when it comes to using organic matters, but this should be a practice that you use because as you move from different root systems around in your growing area, it's going to help quite a bit with soil biological diversity. And that's something that I really encourage you to consider and think about. As I've shared with you today already, there's a lot of more interest in research on the root systems and in thinking about leaving behind root systems of the plants you may be growing. If this was something to consider and think about, you of course would have to really think if it fits in well with your farming plans, and you would still want to combine it with crop rotation and other systems. But ideally, this might be something where at the end of your annual vegetable growing season, you remove much of the crop debris, especially those that might have disease and other pathogens on it, or potentially have them, and then you're leaving behind that root system to overwinter and to just then break down into that next year. It's still a lot to be said with this, and I'm not fully on board to yet just endorse it fully yet, but I think it may be where we start to shift some of our thinking. Another factor that you're going to have to consider is the organic matter, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, which you see here. And this tends to be the rate at which organic matters are decomposed. If a carbon to nitrogen ratio is high, so they have, say, more carbon versus less nitrogen, which you kind of see there with sawdust, a very high C to the end of 371, 5 to 1. There tends to not be enough nitrogen in that product for the microorganism to utilize and break down. So then they will then tend to seek that nitrogen somewhere else, typically from the nitrogen cycle that's in your soil system. So what that then means is that that nitrogen that would have been available for the plant is no longer available because my microorganisms have had to borrow it for a little bit of time. 24 to 1 tends to be the cutoff rate for microbial communities to use their carbon to nitrogen ratio. Below, we tend to see mineralization occur. Above it, immobilization occurs. And I'll talk to you a little bit more what this kind of tends to mean. At the same time, a lot of times the C to N really dictates a organic matter that just may be better as a mulch because it wouldn't necessarily lock as much of that nitrogen away from my microorganisms and their ability to not my plants and their ability not to get it. You do see some common organic matters below this line of compost, cow manure, hairy vetch, poultry manure, blood meal, all have much lower than that 24 to 1 ratio. And most of them really are what we consider organic matters that would break down into the soil and ones where we need to turn to the soil versus those that are really above that line that tend to be more of a mulch on the soil surface level. It is a very common practice to combine. So to combine, say, a leaves with, say, your compost. So you are getting kind of a balancing out, perhaps, of these organic matters if you are to use them. Yet again, I think sometimes it gets back to your access and what is available to you and maybe what's not available to you. This is the nitrogen cycle. A lot of us have seen this before, but to kind of mention kind of what you sometimes see here, kind of within this organic N. You can kind of see kind of what I'm talking about here, where we have this organic N right here, and this is that period, the mineralization or immobilization, where depending on the C to N ratio, it may become immobilized. So it's being added, it's broken down, it's immobilized and basically kind of locked within this organic N versus a C to N that's below that 24, where when it breaks down to the organic N, nitrogen, it could further transform and mineralize to ammonium, nitrate, as well as that kind of potential nitrate system. It's not always a perfect system, and we should be kind of upfront about that. You may not have it as perfect as it could be, but that's kind of what you're looking at there and what the concern can sometimes be. If I was more of an advanced farmer, had been farming for a couple of years, I would lean heavier and kind of worry a little bit more about this kind of C to N ratio versus if I was more of a beginning farmer, just kind of getting started. Another factor to consider here is quality and quantity. So quantity is kind of the time and space that is occupied by roots, as well as residues is maximized versus quality. We have a wide range of carbon to nitrogen ratios kind of mixed in together to kind of help quite a bit with this. As such, encouraging diverse types of food will encourage support microbes, and that will in turn provide very stable organic matter that will address your soil organic matter. So it is kind of these factors, and you'll see this a little bit more when you think more about your organic matters too. A crucial step here also with organic matter management is going to be management. So what we do see is that tilling and soil disturbance can reduce soil organic matter, and this can increase aeration of bacteria that will feed more actively on organic matter. So we could actually not get as much of that organic matter long-term transform into that stable organic matter that we're after. It is a bit of a balancing act here because for a lot of these organic matters, they do need to have some sort of soil contact, and this disturbance in that soil is really crucial. But yet we still want to really think about trying to till only when necessary. And you may look towards conservation tillage like no-till, or looking towards some strip tillage situations, as well as rotation with perennial crops. So considering giving, say, certain growing areas a bit of a break and allowing them to just have continual cover cropping systems on them and in place. But as I share with you, it's a bit of a balancing act, and we are growing most annual crops that do require some sort of annual disturbance for us to actually plant these plants in that growing area. So organic matter is added. They provide a wide range of sugars, starches, and other things, other products in here. They tend to need to be aged on field or composted in most cases. We also need to think that many of them need to be incorporated into the soil and also consider timing these correctly. You will find that sometimes they just need to be timed a bit more than other ones tend to be. This includes manure, compost, leaf litter, kind of any plant material, debris. It also can include bone meal and blood meal, two of which have some pretty nice NPK values, as well as kind of our common mulches in this system too. So these are your added ones. Cover crops, or rather organic matters that are grown, they provide nitrogen, other nutrients. Nitrogen, if it is a leguminous cover crop, they will break down in the soil very differently, so you will have to factor in that carbon to nitrogen ratio a little bit when it comes to this. Many of them also need to flower for full effectiveness of getting the most bang for your buck when it comes to utilizing cover crops. They can, of course, be part of a long-term no-till system. And you also want to think about choosing a cover crop like an organic matter that's grown that can address your other soil problems too. So compost as an added organic matter, it should be finished. It should also be tested. Know, of course, that compost has a very low NPK value, and this tends to be released over 3 years or really more. It tends to be a very stable product with animal or plant materials, depending on the product that you have and the product that you might be using. It also is sometimes the most common organic matter that's recommended to address soil health problems. When folks have compaction problems, when they have other related problems to soil health, I tend to recommend some compost to hopefully address what some of those are. You commonly see vermicast or vermicompost made from earthworms. It can be a little bit expensive. Know that it is a very good organic matter, pretty neutral with soil pH of 7, but also like other composts, a very low NPK value within it. So yet again, just kind of be a little cautious that these should not necessarily be your annual fertility fertilizer needs, just because the NPK values can be very low. For manure, you're going to have kind of two broad categories. You'll have fresh and you'll have composted or dried manure. Composted dried manure, you may also see that it's called aged manure. That's kind of a common term too. A fresh manure, typically we see higher nitrogen content, but we lose a lot of it to the atmosphere, about 21%. It can also acidify our soil over time with lots of organic acids that are broken down through the soil. Be a little cautious of that. In most cases, our vegetables do need some acidity and need to be grown in acidic conditions. They can release various chemical compounds into the soil. I should clarify here that I'm talking more about organic acids and other soil nutrients that would eventually go into there, or nutrients that would go into the soil nutrient cycle. Some of them can also have substantial weed seed problems, especially horse manure. It tends to have a lot of weed seeds in it. The composted, dry manure, aged manure, it tends to contribute more to organic matter because it's already kind of a stable condition, or you have used it in making your compost, and so it actually is one that can just be pretty neutral with it. We do tend to see most weed seeds and pathogens are killed. This is especially true if you are making manure into compost and you are taking temperatures to ensure that it's getting to that right temperature to ensure this. It tends to also be less likely to lead to a nutrient imbalance as well. When using manure, still look to spread into the fall, winter, or at least 6 months before planting into it. It can also be influenced greatly by source, age, storage, bedding material. All of that goes into factor when it comes to utilizing this manure. Cow, horse tends to have more readily available nutrients. Even if it was an aged manure, I still kind of recommend a month before planting. The reason for this is that I think you just really need to give your soil biological community a month to kind of get ready to go before planting. If it's an aged manure, we don't really tend to see that it's going to burn the plants compared to, say, kind of those raw manures where it does. And yet again, the raw manure application is different, the time period is. But I still tend to think about a good month of an aged manure added to the soil can really help kind of get your soil biological communities woken up. Not mentioned on this slide is that if you're a certified organic grower, you do have the 90 to 120 day rule where you can apply raw manure if it is if you're going to be growing crops, in which case the edible portion does not come into contact with the soil. So that would be 90 days of raw manure for something like a tomato versus 120 days, you might see something like cabbage, for instance, with it. Those rules may change, so kind of keep that in mind. But yet again, we still tend to think more of the fall, winter application. This chart gives you a little bit of an overview of the NPK values of a wide range of organic matter. It also gives you the far column shows you the availability of these nutrients, just to give you some context as to will these be available on a seasonal basis versus may take a couple of years. These are all averages, so you actually may find that the NPK value for a certain organic matter you might be using is much different than this. You will note that if it says slow, that tends to be that we expect about a third of that NPK value to be released every year for the next 3 years. That's especially true for compost and some of our other products too. more rapid release, you will find that it tends to be released pretty quickly in that seasonal basis, and the same with some of our medium ones as well with it. Yet again, I'm combining a lot of this information with soil tests to ensure that I'm applying kind of the right amount and what needs to also be applied. Mulch is then left on soil surface between seasons, or this could also be something for years to come, especially in a perennial system. Different mulches also break down over different periods of time, so you will find that situation. More common use, like I share with you in perennial systems, I would still maybe look a little bit towards diversity in your mulching systems, especially as they will break down a little bit differently, and we hope they will break down really well into the organic matter. Because it is on that soil surface, we do expect to lose some of it to the atmosphere and to environmental conditions. So it may not truly get to the end goal of that soil organic matter because we are losing some to the atmosphere and so forth. For some of our annual plants, I would also encourage you to think about maybe turning it under after the season, because that could then kind of break down a little bit further. If I had perennial systems and I had organic or mulches in place on the soil surface, I might still put some compost or some maybe aged manure around the base of these perennial plants just to have additional organic matter in there under that established mulch. So my grown organic matter, this is cover crops. So typically legumes, non-legumes, and brassicas. Non-legumes tends to be my grasses, my grass family. These are cool season, warm season, cover cropping systems. Each has lots of different benefits. They each have very different organic matters with them. Always think about planting your cash crops in mind. And then note that full effectiveness, like I shared with you, tends to be tied to when it actually starts to flower. The benefit with cover crops is that you actually are growing two organic matters. We don't always recognize that, but the above and the below ground organic matters are really important when it comes to adding to your soil organic matter. I would still maybe play around with adding another organic matter, especially an added one if you could. Look towards diversity, especially with the cover cropping systems. You will find so many different ones out there. Test plots, rows, this is all crucial to having a good experience with cover crops and utilizing them effectively in your organic matter systems and addressing soil organic matter. Also combine this with those that could address your other problems. A cover crop, of course, is going to have great organic matter, but there are some that could help with compaction. There are some that could help with nutrient foraging. There are some that could help with weed control. So there's lots of other benefits to them along with this great organic matter that will be added to the soil. This is a kind of an overview of how to choose a cover crop. The one thing to kind of highlight and kind of talk a little more is this exit strategy. And this is taken from Dr. Ajay Nair at Iowa State in some of his cover crop commandments or his cover crop presentations. But I really encourage you to kind of know how you're going to, get rid of that cover crop and address the cover crop, because we want you to utilize it, but we also want you to grow that cash crop of vegetables, fruits, and other things. So you need to know how you need to get rid of it or kill it or something so that you can plant right into it or actually have it be prepared and ready for your next season. So know an exit strategy as you're thinking about the cover crops and how you're going to get out of it. Warm season cover crops, just briefly, they winter kill. They tend to be planted in mid-May to June. We see this very common in Northern Illinois that we have to kind of plant around that time. You might be able to get away with it a little bit earlier depending on your growing area. Some of them will flower. They tend to attract pollinators. Not all of them tend to do. The biomass can be pretty substantial for some of them. Something like sorghum Sudan grass, which you see here, a lot of biomass in the summer, and yet that might be what you really need for your soil organic matter system. They tend to need to be managed, especially the summer ones, and you also have to think about maybe consecutive cuttings. Potentially might be possible in this situation. Some warm season cover crops examples: cowpea, sorghum Sudan grass, vetch, buckwheat. Cowpea is leguminous, which is what we like, so it can sequester nitrogen soil. Buckwheat, as you see here in this photo, tends to be a good pollinator, but also very short season, 45, 50 days. before it starts to flower and goes to seed. And you've got to address it. You have to address buckwheat as it starts to flower. And usually this will mean cutting it and laying on the soil surface. Your cool season cover crops, these are usually overwinter well depending on the crop. Most can have very deep fibrous roots with them. This is leguminous, non-leguminous, as well as brassicas. In northern Illinois, we tend to see established at sometimes mid-July to Labor Day. We can go a little bit into October, but sometimes we don't see as much of a great establishment as we would like for these cool season cover crops. Wheat, cereal, rye, the most common ones for the cool season cover crops, they just perform well across the board. Late planting can be possible with them. As far as just good organic matter, good root systems, we really see that they do a lot of good here. Tillage radish, as you see in this photo, you sometimes see it as daikon radish as well. We have it growing in in some of our raised beds here at the extension office. This was harvested about 2 months into planting. So we planted about the first week of August, and then we followed up at the end of September, and I harvested this. And you can actually see we had lots of good root growth in the matter of 2 months. So it can grow well, but it has to be established in August, or else you will not get this type of organic matter. And at winter kills, it's breaking down right now under the soil cover, or the snow cover rather, up here in northern Illinois. Clover is another category, of course, too. Lots of good organic matter, a good amount of nitrogen added to the soil surface as well, or rather into the soil system. Can be a good companion plant with other crops. Can also be a very good green manure in that system too. But one that I can balance out my soil fertility needs here. One way that some folks will kill certain cover crops is with green manure. So this is an act where I'm actually kind of turning them underneath the soil surface into the soil, usually with some form of a tiller or some kind of other apparatus. So it will kill it. It will tend to kind of increase this microbial community, especially in the springtime when it's done. So you're kind of giving them good, fresh residues to actually eat and to actually start breaking down. The issue, though, is that it's not always killed. It can be a little troublesome. Hairy vetch, which you see in this photo, is also one where, yes, it is a green manure, but my goodness, if you've tried to actually till this under, the vining characteristics can be pretty hard to work with and pretty hard to deal with. Living mulch is also where a lot of organic matter discussion is going, growing your own kind of living mulching system with cover crops where, you could then be given a break to some of your rows of plants that you're growing on a seasonal basis. So this long-term crop rotation is really where we start to see a lot of interest in it. It could address weed control, could help with moisture, nutrients, but also some really good organic matter. For fruit production, this looks to be leguminous, buckwheat. For vegetables, sometimes spring oats as well as clovers fit within the system pretty well too. But it is basically a cover crop planted between the rows of your main crop, and this could allow for you to kind of add more organic matter between seasons for certain growing areas on your operation and not grow anything in there. And yes, it is acting as weed control, but it also could be adding additional good organic matter for those rows that kind of need maybe a little bit of a break between seasons. A lot of what we've talked about today is a little bit more annual plant focused. I want to just kind of mention here that perennial soil organic matters fairly stable. We see soil biological communities really stable when it comes to these perennial plants. They have a very closed nutrient system in most cases. And they also tend to be kind of a soil food web that's connected quite well with these roots and the rhizospheres. Still look towards seasonal organic matter added under the mulches if you can. Still kind of see if it's possible for you to kind of pull back some of the mulches that you might have in place, put some compost down, put some aged manure down, have it in some capacity with it. This is probably more likely for small fruits, for berries, for brambles. Tree fruits, it may not be. And that tends to be just because we're trying to be a little concerned about managing some of our wildlife. And wildlife, especially moles and other smaller animals, will find a place to harbor and hang out around a mulch system around your fruit trees. So we may not see that too much. But really look at the pros and the cons here with the situation. So, best practices in organic matters then. I tend to be in the camp of always be adding. And while you may be at a place where you've added so much that you're like, maybe I'll take a break there. And I can recognize that. But I think especially if you're growing in a new area that you've not grown before, you're growing lots of annual plants, this is really a good time to really start thinking about adding and really focusing a lot on organic matter diversity. I also think about timing things appropriately. You see this chart from NRCS, and we actually see that there is an increase in bacterial and fungal activity that happens around early summer. So thinking about, say, end of May into June, we start to see activity. This is a time where these communities could really use some food and really think about where your compost application is. This might mean the end of April, this might mean mid-April, where you might apply the good organic matter. Try to keep things covered, have some kind of surface mulch layer in place. Grow your own cover crops, grow your own organic matter. Still plan for crop rotation. That's something to not let go of because this can help with it. From a beginner point of view, you're probably in an adding stage. As you become more advanced, you want to do adding, and you also want to consider growing your own cover crop because you're going to find some really great benefits for your soil organic matter by actually growing your own organic matter. More here, consider a bit about that seed to N ratio. I think it's especially crucial when it comes to maybe some of the mulches that you might be using or organic matters you might be using as well. Soil contact is crucial here too. If you're using any kind of plastic mulch system, know that you've got to get the organic matter in touching that soil in some capacity. So that maybe it's around the base of the plants that season, or it actually is at the start of the season where you're adding the organic matter and then you're covering up with the plastic mulch. But you've got to have contact here. There may want to shred some of these organic matters and turn to the soil just to kind of help with decomposition. Consider too your soil texture. You may find that maybe limits sometimes what organic matters make the most sense to you. Switch up the organic matters, and then maybe it's time to think about leaving those roots behind. And yet again, we're still thinking a little bit more about this for some of our annual systems. But we might be at a place of thinking that these good root systems could really be providing a lot of good for us within this capacity. Yet again, I'm still wrapping my head around what this could look like, other than just removing the upper portion of those crops that you might be growing. Start small, work your way up. Get a soil test, figure out what's going on, but really think about adding to that system. So interpreting your actions. If you were in my classroom today and we were talking about this, you would get to see the underwear test, which you see here in this photo. The underwear test is done to kind of measure soil biology. So you're planting a pair of men's white cotton briefs, usually during the mid-summer. You're planting them for about 2 months or in about a depth of 2 to 3 inches. You unbury them, these men's briefs, and because it is a food source, you actually see a lot of decomposition on this to then show that you've got some really good soil biological activity occurring. It's purely anecdotal, but it sometimes is an interesting visual estimate for sometimes what that soil health and what the organic matter kind of looks like. The other thing to share here is that tests will tell you some things, but they don't always tell you the full picture. That percentage of soil organic matter doesn't tell me if it's mostly fresh ingredients that have been added in the last 5 years versus that stable organic matter that is mostly of the humus itself. So we don't have a full picture sometimes from the soil tests. It may take 3 to 5 years to also see this change. So most of the time, the soil organic matter information you're getting back isn't necessarily breaking that down to stable versus active. The labs are getting better. There are 3 common tests when it comes to soil organic matter. The one that we mostly see is the kind of the weight loss upon ignition. That's the most standard soil test that you see in a standard soil from a standard soil testing lab. The top 2 are a little bit trendier. They may be a little more costly. Also look towards Cornell with some good soil health guides. So I'm starting to wrap up a little bit here. So I would say, Zach, we encourage you to start giving some questions in. I want to mention a couple resources and guides for you. Cornell, as you see in the bold, the Comprehensive Assessment of Soil Health. It's a very good training manual on soil health and soil organic matter. I really like it quite a bit. That would be a great place to start with you. The discoveries, the changes, the research, all of that stuff that's happening in the last couple of years is kind of zeroed in into this document called Soil Biology and Soil Organic Matter. What do recent discoveries mean for soil management? Andrew McGuire has just hit the nail on the head when it comes to kind of summing this up. So I really like that document and encourage you to kind of look at that. Some of the other resources here are kind of more soil organic matter overview, different extension and publications that can help you with that. All right, so that's my phone number. That's my email. Sorry about the disturbance earlier with the phone call, but yes, let's get some questions answered if we can.
Great, thanks, Grant. Great discussion on the differences and confusion sometimes with the difference between soil organic matter and organic matter input. So great discussion. We do have a few questions coming in that we can pull in a second. We've got about 5 minutes left, so we will likely go over the 1 p.m. hour for this discussion period for those of you who need to get off the call. I actually want to start off with a comment and maybe open up for some discussion or some feedback from you, Grant, related to two things. One, compost applications, and also manure, particularly the use of manure in a raw form or what you were describing as an aged form. I want everyone to realize or just recognize that the federal government, in the form of the Produce Safety Rule and the Food Safety Modernization Act, they have a very specific definition of what they consider to be what they call biological soil amendments of animal origin, and how they consider them treated versus untreated. So raw manure and aged and stacked manure, at least in the FDA's eyes, would be considered a raw, untreated amendment. So we need to think about those application intervals before adding to them to the soil. Grant mentioned the NOP 91 20-day rule, which the FDA currently is okay with and saying go ahead and continue to use that. But they actually have a reserved clause in the Produce Safety Rule, and they're still haven't made a final determination about what their perspective on adding raw, untreated manures in particular to the soil. And it's a little counterintuitive too, because most of the fertilizer value from raw manures in particular come early on, right? So those manures lose a lot of their fertilizer value within the first few days, in fact, first couple weeks. So it's something to consider with manure in terms of food safety, produce safety issues, and whether we're treating them as a fertilizer versus organic material. I would recommend definitely composting manures if at all possible before adding, because then that can increase your chances for adding it to the soil. The other thing I just wanted to briefly mention, and Grant mentioned this multiple times, in terms of compost having low NPK values. While that is true on a pure dry weight analysis basis, we can get into trouble, and there's a lot of interest in this, particularly with small scale farming no-till systems, where particularly with animal-based compost, that based on that we can add lots of phosphorus to the soil, particularly if we're adding large amounts at a time. So there's this impression that more compost is always better. But in the case of phosphorus loading in soils, if we're adding compost and manures that have high levels of phosphorus, that can have downstream ecosystem effects, and we can load too much phosphorus even with compost that have low NPK analysis. If we're adding lots of them, and we're talking on the scale of 1 to 6 inches of compost, right, to beds and to fields at a time. So I just wanted to comment on that. And Grant, I don't know if you had any sort of follow up in regards to both the manure and sort of compost question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate the assistance there. Because it is something where, like, yeah, I mean, it's like, oh, this sounds great, we should be adding these all the time, and yet we still have to kind of step back and really think about what the soil system is that we're operating in, as well as what the growing systems are too, where the end goals are with these. I still look heavily towards raw manure application in the fall. That still tends to be where I tend to kind of have a pulse for it.
Right, and I would totally agree. And if the compost, I mean, if the manure is composted and you can certify that it's compost either through your records or a farmer's records, then the application interval is actually 0 if you properly compost. I just wanted to make everyone aware of that. So it's a little confusing, and the FDA's insight on this confuses it even more. So stay tuned for guidance when it comes to particularly raw or aged manure applications moving forward. Let's see here. Let's go ahead and jump into the questions here. So someone did, I brought that up because someone did have a question about adding chicken manure and a question about salmonella. So I think that discussion should answer that particular question. So let's go to the top. One question you mentioned early on, something about organic matter inputs that could cause compaction or reduce air and water flow. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. I would see, especially with some of the leaf litter that you might be using, you may find that that mulch layer could be restricting some of the airflow with your soil. You know, especially as if you have some kind of product that maybe you haven't shredded properly, or you haven't necessarily got fluffed up, if you will, you may find that especially during changes in the weather, it could create so much pressure that goes right on top of the soil that you may have more of a compaction problem. Tends to be more mulches than anything.
Okay, great. And then another question, I sort of answered it privately, but we can just kind of bring this up in terms of recommendations and amounts of organic matter inputs. I know you kind of hit on that a little bit, but they were referencing, laying down sheets of newsprint, adding 6 inches of, grass cuttings, incorporating that in, and the question in the fall, and the question is, should I be adding something else? Is that good quality of organic material? Is this acceptable? And I mentioned that it was a good start, but that, maybe monitoring your soil organic matter levels and, diversifying your organic matter inputs is important. But I think you hit on this already, that we don't really have solid recommendations the way that we might with fertilizer or soil correction in terms of the amount of organic matter to add and what kind.
Yeah, we really don't. And I think it's a kind of a case-by-case basis. I think what I do tend to see and tend to encourage is just, changing it up when you can, looking towards different changes because you need to have just diverse organic matters for those biological communities.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then a question about, I think you mentioned grazing stimulating nematode population. So the question is actually, how does grazing stimulate nematode?
Yeah, so that grazing term, it's meaning that the populations of prey, bacteria, fungus, and so forth that the nematodes eat on, they're grazing on it. So they're eating that. That's what that should mean. So when we see increases of, say, bacterial fungal communities and the nematodes are present, you will see them graze more actively. I mean, let me clarify. You're not going to see this, but just kind of know that that's what we're getting at here, is that they're grazing, they're eating bacterial and fungal.
Okay, great. And then there was a question about local experience with sandfoin, which is a type of perennial herb, I believe. I don't have any personal experience with it. I think it's a leguminous pasture species. I'll just throw that out there. I don't know if we have an answer to that, but that was brought up. And I know Doug's on the line as a co-host. Doug, do you have any experience with sandfoin? You can chime in at any time. Another question was related to modified Morgan soil tests versus standard soil tests. It was just a general question. And I think that really depends on your specific soil type, pH and clay mineralogy, whether you're doing modified Morgan, Malick, Bray, so on and so forth. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, it's going to really depend quite with it. I mean, most of the time we're seeing the standard soil test could mostly address what your needs are. But if you are someone who is very active when it comes to really wanting to focus on your soil organic matter, then you may tend to lean heavier on some of these that are a little bit more particular with what your needs are going to be.
Yeah, it definitely, as you've probably heard, if you've heard about soil tests discussed in the past, it really can be specific to your climate, soil type, and particularly with pH. when it comes to phosphorus analysis, that can be critical. I know if your pH is above a certain level, the sodium bicarb is probably better. If it's lower, more acidic, weak, strong and weak bray, Morgan, Malick, so it really, if you have those specific questions, you can reach out to Extension or ask your local lab what they would actually recommend. So another question here, how does a green mulch consumption of nutrients interact with nutrient needs of the vegetables that you are growing?
So in most cases, this green manure kind of product itself, especially if it's something that's kind of a leguminous kind of a cover crop, as it starts to decompose, it should, in most cases, make some of those nutrients available into that nutrient cycle for that plant to use that season. You still need to, create that green manure, turn it into the soil, and then sometimes wait a good month or 2 months in order for things to kind of stabilize a little bit and to kind of get those cycles going. But you will still find that they, in most cases, will potentially address some of those nutrient needs in that season.
Great. So
there's a lot of research out there about it.
So a question just came in, and I actually have an answer for it, but you can feel free to answer as well, in terms of best method to turn under cover crop in order to minimize soil disturbance. So, a lot of growers who are using sort of smaller scale no-till systems right now, one method they're using is, to flail mow, to terminate, and using things like, tarping, or soil solarization using clear tarps to kind of break down that material without having to actually till it in. You still have to wait maybe a 2 to 3 week period before it breaks down enough to plant into, but that is one method. Do you have any other comments?
Yeah, that would be kind of the most common method to do, having some kind of flailing system in place, to actually kind of get that organic matter in a place and kind of get a good bed kind of situated with it. Yeah, that's typically what we kind of see. So it's not always a perfect situation, but it is something that you would kind of play around with.
Okay, someone in the chat box was asking something about zoo brew, which I'm not familiar with what that is, but I'm guessing that it might be a manure tea application or a compost tea application. If they could clarify that would be appreciate that. But do you have any comments in general about manure teas or compost teas in terms of particularly stimulating soil biological activity?
Yeah, we don't tend to have just enough research to really figure out just yet, if those have immediate changes or long-term changes in the soil system and soil biological communities. Yeah, again, there's just so many factors that are going into that biological community that introducing something that, would have gotten there or never been there, we can't really vouch for it as much as we wish we could with it. So there's just lots of questions and unanswered at this point.
So we'll go ahead and make this the last question. Again, thanks everyone for sticking around. Does adding cardboard or newspaper under mulch impede soil aeration or cause other issues? I leave horse manure and wood shaving piled 1 to 2 years. Can be added directly to perennials and garden annuals. Should I age it longer before application?
So I would think with your cardboard situation, if it's wet, if you have noticed that it is breaking down, it should be okay. I'd still be a little cautious of it, just because you may have some limitations when it comes to actually, having some air exchange within it. As far as the second part of that, kind of the manure of it, it sounds to me like it has been aged in those 2-year process. So you should be able to then kind of utilize it quite well. So I would say it sounds good, but like I share with you all, there's so many questions sometimes about what the best practices are. And yet again, it's going to get back to your soil texture, and with what the performance that you've seen out of your soil too.
Excellent. Well, I really want to thank Grant so much today for sharing his experience here with us. The QR code is being displayed right here, so you can do a quick evaluation, but I will email that along with a link to the webinar very shortly. Hopefully you got something out of this, and this really kind of clarified your perspective and knowledge about soil organic matter versus organic matter inputs. So with that, have a great day, and we will see you next week.